They called me a mistake before they learned my name. I remember the way the word folded around my ribs like a belt, how it tightened whenever someone looked at the place where my hands used to hide my stomach. Rain had been falling in ribbons that evening, the kind of rain that turned the streetlights into smeared coins, the kind that made the leather of my coat smell of wet smoke and coffee. The city smelled like iron and old paper, and every step I took echoed hollow on the sidewalk. My name is Joel. I am 24. I am an Omega. I am pregnant, and in this part of the East Side, that word marks you like a stain. I was trying to keep my seams together, to walk like anyone else, when the three of them arrived at the corner clinic and turned the world into a room that only smelled of one thing, their scent, layered and impossible to ignore. They did not look like brothers at first glance. One's face was sculpted cold, the other's hands trembled under a table of concern, and the third watched you as if he were calculating the exact temperature to make a glass shatter. When they stepped under the awning, the rain made a soft percussion on the metal, and the street vendor shouted a single warped note, as if the city itself had paused to listen. They did not know that the secret inside me would force every truth to rearrange itself. What happens when the men who are supposed to be danger become the only shelter you can imagine? And if you have 5 minutes, please listen the way someone might listen to a confession in the back of a church. I learned to count my steps so my belly hit the table at the bakery less, so the landlord nodded less, so Marco the neighbor would not have another reason to knock and ask for rent he had no right to ask for. The first block of my life was small rooms and smaller kindnesses. My mother taught me how to hide a bruise behind a laugh, how to slice an apple so thin it looked like patience. I used to think that survival came in neat slices, and that if I folded myself small enough, the city would ignore me. Childhood smelled like lemon soap and damp newspapers. School smelled like chalk and the taste of fear pressed behind teeth. By the time I learned to call myself Omega quietly in my head, I also learned that my father left when words turned into fists, and that my name had a shadow that followed it. In my 20s, I found work cleaning in the back of a clinic, a place where people with tired faces came and traded secrets with doctors for silence. My hands learned the rhythm of sterile gloves, and the smell of antiseptic began to comfort me. Then the change came. A line on a test, a sudden swell under my clothes that made me soften in parts I had kept hard. I was elated and terrified in equal measure. I wanted to tell someone, and then I remembered the way the schoolyard laughed when I first showed up with a scrape on my arm, and the whispering hands that would point and say Omega as if it were a brand. Loss made me learn not to give names to hopes. The present felt like a glass I could hold but not lift if anyone so much as breathed on it. In the clinic, Rosa, the barista from the corner cafe, would call my name softly and keep the change in a tin. Luca, my manager at the small clinic, liked to joke about late shifts and would bring me soup when I double-booked nights and no one else knew I had not eaten. Officer Chen made a show of nodding politely outside and then walked away with a look that meant he would not be the kind of help that left marks. Dr. Alvarez adjusted my file and spoke too clinically about risk, but he sat and listened when I cried once and never once used the word stigma. I sometimes thought of Mateo, the boy from my street who kept a broken radio, of Elsa, the landlady who had a portrait of a woman who never smiled, of Naomi, the reporter across town who wrote stories that made people blink. 8 people or so moved through my life like cold currents, some protective, some indifferent, and some things that curled like claws. The first real encounter happened by the clinic trash bins when I went out for air. The night tasted like diesel and burnt bread. A bus hissed at the stop, the neon of a lottery kiosk buzzed, and the clinic door sighed closed behind me. They were there, a trio of silhouettes that at first might have been strangers. One stepped forward, and the rain seemed to hang on his coat. His voice was even, a dangerous calm that smelled like cedar and winter. The second had eyes that softened but never reached his mouth, and his palms were rough as if he kept the world close to his hands. The third had fingers that never stopped moving, as if he were remapping the city with small gestures. They were alpha triplets. I recognized the scent pattern immediately. It wrapped around me like a net. That connection was physical and impossible to ignore, a low hum in my chest that told me my body knew them before my head did. They spoke to each other in a shorthand so old it felt territorial, and then one of them looked at me like a verdict. The conversation would have been ordinary, but for the way the rain made every word slick. They asked for directions as if they were searching for a name. I said nothing. When the cold alpha reached out, there was a small involuntary recoil in my thighs like a memory. He smiled once and said, "Joel, we have been looking for you." The three mouths formed the question at different times, and in the space between I heard my own name as if it were a currency. The exchanges were long, layered breaths, looked like a court. Cold man: "Joel, did you think you could hide?" Joel: "I did not try to hide from you. Please just leave me alone." Tender man: "Leave him alone. He is clearly not well. Joel, what happened to you?" Cold man: "He is an Omega. He looks like one and he smells like one." Practical man: "Smell will change when marked. You know this better than anyone." Joel: "Marked? I am not marked. Please do not say, please do not touch my stomach." Cold man: "We are not for the weak in this city. Why would you run to a clinic where everyone knows everyone?" Joel: "I came for help. I came to keep the baby safe." Tender man: "Omega pregnant? You should have said. Marco could have helped you." Cold man: "Marco is a neighbor, not kin. Kin keeps its own safe." Practical man: "You are asking for trouble by being out alone at night. Joel? Joel?" "I have no one. I only have my rent and a shelf with canned tomatoes and a coat." Cold man: "You have us now, whether you want it or not." The exchange had the cadence of challenge and offer. Each line was punctuated by small physical reactions, a hand finding a pocket, a ridge of muscle tightening, my own breath hitching at the scent of cedar and smoke. There were at least 6 senses alive in that corner. My sight took in the rain and the way the streetlight carved their faces. My hearing peeled words into thinner meanings. My smell was practically drowning me in alpha scent. My skin remembered a touch that had not happened yet. My stomach answered like someone had rung a bell inside me, and my instinct told me to flee. That night ended with a card placed on my palm and names tucked into corners of my mind. They left me with more questions than answers, and the sense that a net had closed around the part of me that used to be safe. Word travels in our neighborhood like a virus. Within days, subtle things changed. Luca, the clinic manager, started offering fewer shifts and asked if I could take nights that would involve less conversation. Elsa, the landlady, raised the rent twice in a month with a single-line text that said, "Due end of month." Marco tapped on my door with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes and borrowed my kettle and never returned it. Naomi, the reporter, asked for a quote about a local man who had been seen with triplets from a family she associated with organized protection. I listed the people who touched my life in that month and how each reacted. Matteo brought a radio with a dead station and tried to make me laugh. Dr. Alvarez called once and gave a detailed medical suggestion, then asked if I had considered a private clinic. Officer Chen stood outside sometimes and did not come in. My day shrank to corridors and small tasks. The stigma became a shadow that entered rooms before me. In the middle of all of that, I kept thinking about why the three names kept flitting through my head, clandestine as moths. Their presence pushed me into a new kind of isolation, a safe kind almost, because the city had ways of punishing what it did not recognize. They came back to me in the third week, a slow invasion rather than a thunderclap. The alphas reappeared at the bakery where Rosa worked and watched me as if I were a map. They sat like a triad of statues, and the way they fell into conversation made the staff hush. I could feel the heat in the room, even though the morning was cool. The cold one ordered black coffee and watched the door as if it were a point on a grid. The tender one nursed a roll and kept offering me half bites. The practical one made phone calls between the sips of his tea, and his eyes kept flicking to me like someone preparing a plan. A messenger of sorts arrived with an invitation that was not called an invitation. It was a request. A dinner at one of the townhouses on the river, and rules attached like a coat over a dangerous thing. The language they used was careful, but there was a subtext that reminded me of how to be unseen and how to be theirs if I chose to accept. The dialogue that night pulled at old fears and new curiosities. Tenderman: "You should come have dinner with us, Joel. It is rude to refuse when someone offers shelter, Joel." "I am not sure shelter is what I need. I need rent and quiet and a doctor with a good bedside manner." Cold Man: "Shelter can be more than a roof. A roof can be allegiance." Practical Man: "We can offer you protection and work, if you want it. We can help with rent and food." Joel: "Help sounds like a trap. I was taught to count the traps first." Tenderman: "We do not promise easy. You will be seen, and you will be marked, maybe in ways you do not like." Joel: "Marked means I lose who I was." Cold Man: "You will gain a place where no one calls you a mistake." Practical Man: "Your baby will have a name, and not a rumor. What else do you want?" "I want to sleep without hearing someone shout at the door. I want to keep this child safe." Tenderman: "Then come, the house will be strange, but it will be safe for now." Their words were a slow weave, promises threaded with warnings. The offer contained practical details: a promise of a room, help with doctor costs, a driver named Mateo who would take me to appointments, and an assurance that they would keep anyone from trespassing. The deal smelled of cheap incense and coffee, and it had the weight of a rope. I said yes, not because I was naive, but because the cost of saying no seemed like a cliff I had to step off, and I did not have a parachute. Days at the townhouse taught me the triplets were well engineered in their differences. The cold alpha called Armand kept his knives in a drawer labeled tools and spoke with measured sentences. He seemed to want the world to be arranged on a grid and himself at the origin. Scenes of him watching the city were like photographs that made you feel smaller. Milo, the tender one, handled the domestic tasks and made rice that tasted like childhood and whispered small consolations that reached places other words could not. He held my hand once during a thunderstorm, and I felt my pulse slow, as if someone had turned down the volume on my fears. Nico, the practical one, had a phone for every problem and a plan for every problem. He squinted at paperwork like a man who understood systems and how to bend them. They moved through rooms like a single organism, 3 parts of a whole with rituals I was not invited to fully see. Their interactions with each other contained a language older than my fear. Things like possession and devotion, threaded with a complicated tenderness. They did not shout. They did not have to. Their presence rearranged my days and taught me small new rules. Always knock twice before entering Armand's study, never to touch Milo while he ate. Without asking, Nico updated the contact list every week. The house revealed other people too. Naomi visited once and left with a notebook full of questions. Marco came in bearing groceries and left with a look of gratitude that bordered on fear. Luca sneaked into the garden at night and left cigar smoke on his sleeves. Dr. Alvarez insisted on checking my charts and muttered about risk like someone trying to keep a promise. Officer Chen still hung outside and talked to the gate guard whose name was Samuel and who shaved in the mornings in a mirror that reflected the river. I learned the names and faces around us. The household expanded to include a driver named Mateo who hummed old songs, a cook named Elsa who called me by my given name, and a young courier called Rena who delivered packages and news. Tension arrived with small ruptures, then with one loud crash. It began as rumors, a man threatened outside the clinic, a window broken on Luca's van, a note tucked under my door with one word, curse. Then one night, the alley behind the bakery turned into a scene I will not forget. Someone tried to drag Mateo into a dark doorway. I heard the struggle, smell of gasoline and iron and fear, and the city became a different animal. I ran and felt my body move in a way I had not known it could. Armand arrived like winter, a cold presence that separated itself from light. The way he moved made lungs ache. Milo's voice tore with worry, and Nico barked the plan. The fight was brief and terrible. Shouts from the assailants mixed with my own name and the sick impact of a door into a shoulder bone. The attackers fled like rodents, and in the aftermath, the sense of being prey reached back into me and pinched. Moment of tension. 1. I remember the way the alley smelled of wet rubber and honey from a spilled bottle, and how my hands trembled as if they were trying to become small animals. They grabbed Mateo by the collar and tried to pull him into the doorway, a hulking shadow that wanted to swallow him. Armand moved like a blade, cutting through water. There was no hesitation, only the sound of his boots, the crack of bodies hitting plaster, and the soft animal cry, a thing that comes up from somewhere you cannot name. My instinct was to run, but my feet rooted. Milo kept shouting his name, and then was on the man who had his hand on Mateo's throat, like a tide pulling back. My heart stuttered, and the world narrowed to the smell of iron, sweat, and the metallic taste of fear on my tongue. The attackers left fingerprints of blood on the pavement and a note that said, "Warning, we own this part of town." That night the house filled with whispered plans. They considered calling Officer Chen, and then did not. They considered moving me to another city, and then did not. Nico explained surveillance options and arranged for a short-term security detail while Armand went to find out who sent the note. The explanation of how they worked was clinical and precise. The security briefing detailed a grid of known rival groups, cameras that looked at blind spots, changeover schedules, and a repository of evidence that included call logs and receipts. It was a tidy list of things that made danger feel mapped and therefore conquerable. The city paper ran a small piece a few days later about a scuffle behind the bakery, and mentioned a local clinic worker who had been seen leaving with 3 men connected to regional protection. Naomi's piece had a tone of curiosity, and the comments below were worse than stones. The stigma followed me into public spaces, and the townhouse windows suddenly felt like thin skin between inside and out. I noticed how people looked at me differently when I walked with Armand. Friendships folded into contracts. The alphas tried to explain their history with the city in fragments and cautious truths. Backstory of the antagonists and father figure. The triplets had a history, the kind that smelled like old money and older debts. Their father had been a man who built alliances with his eyes like blueprints. He taught them to protect what he called the family shorthand for territory, blood, and influence. Armand learned cold precision from him, a sense that vulnerability was a liability and control was currency. Milo absorbed the pieces of gentleness that their mother left behind, the soft rituals of care, and a love for small domesticities that made him human. Nico received the training of logistics, the maps, the contracts, and the ability to close doors without anyone hearing. The father figure was reputed and feared in the East Side, a man whose name Naomi had written about once, and then only in inverted commas as rumor. He died before I met them, but the patterns he left remained like rules embedded in their bones. Their father's absence created expectations they wore like armor. They lived with the memory of his methods and of the town he had calibrated. It made them dangerous, and it made them capable of building a different kind of family around me. There were secrets inside Armand that read like a ledger of cruelty. He once had a lover who betrayed him, and the consequence was brutal. The lover disappeared, and a line of men understood that crossing Armand would cost you more than pride. Milo kept a photograph of a child tucked inside his wallet, a face he would not show anyone. Nico had a ledger with names and dates, and if you listened to him speak about numbers, he would talk like a man reciting a liturgy. Their history was a mixture of tenderness and threat, the kind that made the townhouse a castle and a cage at once. As days passed, the tension built into a crescendo. Someone set fire to the garden bins one night, and the smoke made the house smell like funerary rites. A man followed me home once, and Armand waited like a trap. Instead of a single event, it was a series of tight moments in which people watched and judged, and sometimes acted, and sometimes failed. 3 peaks of crisis came that felt like the house itself shuddered each time. Moment of tension 2. At the gala thrown by a rival family, the trio decided to introduce me to the public as someone under their protection. The hall glittered with lights, and the air tasted like champagne and latex gloves from the staff. A voice through the crowd said, "Omega," in a tone that wanted me visible as ruin. Someone spat an ugly rumor into the air, and the sound landed like ice on my skin. That night, Armand moved like an executioner. He spoke to men who thought themselves untouchable, with a low voice and a bone-softening threat. Milo held me until the noise stopped, and Nico made quiet calls into rooms of men who had once thought they were untouchable. The truth came out that night, that protection is a language often paid in obedience and acquiescence. Moment of tension 3. The worst of all was the revelation that the attackers had been hired. A name appeared in Dr. Alvarez's notes, a local developer who wanted the clinic lot and had been buying off small men to create pressure. The evidence was small: receipts, a courier's note, and a security camera angle that had been intentionally smeared. Armand and Nico went to collect proof and returned with bruises and a folder of pictures. The images were clinical. One, a bloody fist imprinted on a door, a scarf left with a business card, and a license plate that matched a car connected to the developer's security detail. The revelation showed me the scale of what I had wandered into and made the choice all the more sharp. In the midst of this, personal revelations braided into public ones. The scent recognition intensified the more time I spent with them. There were nights when Armand would touch my shoulder, and I felt as if the world tilted. And Milo would hum lullabies in an accent I had never noticed before. And Nico would set down a plan for the baby's future, as if he had already named half of a life that had not been born yet. I was pulled by the safety they offered, and pushed by the fear that I would lose the person I had been before their attention wrapped around me. The house started to feel like a womb that had windows. The confrontation came when Papa's men decided to escalate, and the developer sent men with promises of money and with blunt instructions. They marched at dawn, and the townhouse woke like a field of nerves. Officer Chen refused to come in that morning, the fear of paperwork outweighing whatever duty he might have had. Armand asked for a meeting with the developer, a risky move that smelled of a duel. I remember the conversation in the garden before they left, the way the air carried the scent of coffee and of a specific cedar that belonged to Armand. Armand, you will not touch this house, you hear me? Developer's man, your family is small in comparison to interests. We are building, and people who stand in the way are removed. Armand, we are not in the way. We will take compensation and move on, or we will not move. Nico, you will produce receipts for every transaction that led to intimidation, or we will pursue legal avenues. Developer's man, legal avenues do not touch things like ours. Milo, legal is for people who can afford to be broken. We can afford that. You cannot. Armand, we do not want a war, but we will not be pushed. Joel will not be harmed. Joel, I am tired of being protected like a box of glass. I want to choose not to be a token, not to be a story in a headline. Armand, choice is a privilege. We can give you more choices if you let us. Joel, what if I refuse the kind of help you give? Are you ready for the cost? Armand, whatever the cost, we will pay it, and you will not be alone. The meeting ended without a clear victor. The developer's man left with a promise and a threat. The next morning, my name appeared in Naomi's column, and the city read the story as it pleased. The legal description that Nico demanded was written by a lawyer named Cecilia, who agreed to file a motion to force an inquiry. The procedure was described in a clinical tone, with dates and the standard list of documents. The process looked like this: an initial complaint filed with the Municipal Bureau, followed by a request for footage preservation, notification to the developer's corporate counsel, and a subpoena for the security logs. This passage alone sounded like a map for extraction and ran 283 characters long and read like an Euripides of hope. They also set up physical measures, cameras at blind spots, a rotation of guards, and a driver who would escort me to appointments. The crisis forced me into decision territory, where before I had let life wash over me. I was asked now to take a stand. The alphas argued in the quiet hours, and I overheard them in fragments. Nico, if we are going to be visible, we must control the narrative. Milo, control does not mean taking away his agency. Joel should have a say. Armand, he is fragile. He does not yet understand the reach of our world. Nico, fragility is not a condition to be managed by others. We will teach him to be strong by keeping him safe. Joel, I am not a prize you can hide under velvet. I am someone who is making a choice. Their debates were layered with worry and power. In one long conversation that lasted until the rain stopped, the three of them sat on the terrace and asked me to choose the path I wanted. Tender man, stay with us, and we will mark you in a way that binds you but keeps you safe. Cold man, or leave and face the city where your child might live without protection. Practical man, or find a middle way. We will set boundaries and sometimes step back. Remember, the word bond appears often in our folklore. They offered me the possibility of a mark, a public symbol that would make me theirs and signal to the city a new order. The word conjured fear and security in a single breath. For an Omega, this city being marked could mean stability, the legal protection of a family unit, a guarantee against another man's claim. It could also mean a loss. The scent of my autonomy faded at the edges. The marking ritual was described with a gravity that made the skin on my neck prickle. To be marked is to be seen, to be legally acknowledged in some circles, and yet in others to be claimed. Moment of tension 4. The marking discussion turned into a test. The developer sent a subtle proof of escalation, a car window smashed, and a note in the mailbox with the word removal scrawled in angry ink. The townhouse security cameras caught a shadow of a man slipping a device into the garden hedge, a device that smelled like gasoline and metal. Armand exploded into motion. The sound of his voice peeled the sky, and they moved like orchestrated storm. I watched as he reconstructed a plan in fragments and then executed it. There was a sting operation with a decoy and Nico's phone calls and a quiet purchase of evidence and a track of the man's purchases that led back to a subcontractor. The tactical description of the operation read like forensic poetry. Bait reporting, surveillance loops, and a chain of custody of evidence, which counted as 296 characters in its clinical summary. In the end, we had names, receipts, and a shaky confession given under pressure. The city police reluctantly made a noise of action. The charges were small, but they existed. My choice came on a quiet morning, with the light soft and the smell of boiled rice thick in the air. I thought of the clinic, and of Luca's van, and of Marco's borrowed kettle. I thought of the small radio Mateo fixed, and of Naomi's column, and of Dr. Alvarez's quiet nod. I thought of what it would mean to give a name to the child inside me, and to the way my belly kicked like a secret drum. I thought of the cost if I refused to accept protection, and of what the city might do with a child who had no family to defend him. I thought of how Armand's hands had steadied a blade, and how Milo had hummed lullabies that still played in my dreams. And I made the choice. I felt like a traitor, and like a daughter, and like a person naming their future. The marking itself was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new language. They did not mark me with cruelty. Armand's hand was steady, and his eyes surprisingly soft. He placed the mark low, and it felt like a warm press of acceptance. Milo whispered a promise into my ear that was less a vow and more a prayer. Nico signed papers and arranged legal representation, and the mark became a document in the hands of Cecilia, the lawyer who took the case to court. The city read the filing like a small fire, a new code that said this family existed. After the mark, the world did not become gentle overnight. There were nights when the city still hissed and men still called from dark corners. But there were also mornings when I woke up and no one had dared to shout at my window. Protection is a complicated currency. It bought me a small room with lace curtains and a doctor who came to appointments who took my concerns seriously. I started to plan the child's name with Milo, and we argued about syllables over coffee while Armand listened like a judge and Nico drafted amendments. Regrettably, the path to building a family is not a straight line. The developer continued to make noise, and Naomi got interested in the public story of an Omega who had been marked by a triad. The legal process dragged, and the police report read like a ledger that had missing columns. Officer Chen testified with the weary air of someone who thinks paperwork is a pain, and then gave a detailed account that helped the case. The trial was a short, unglamorous thing, and the developer was fined a small amount and ordered to stop harassment. But the court system had cracks, and the protection we bought with law came with limitations. In the middle of it all, I had to learn how to be a parent in the small hours. The fetal kicks became a conversation. Milo counted with me at night, and we pressed our palms to the belly and listened. Armand taught me how to make a safe budget, and Nico laid out emergency protocols and contacts. The town began to shift in small ways. Some neighbors who had once been indifferent now offered casseroles. Marco returned my kettle and apologized. Luca left cigarettes by the back door as an offering. Naomi wrote a piece that humanized parts of me without sensationalizing too much. There was also backlash. A letter to the editor calling into question our morals, and a street preacher in front of the clinic who shouted his certainties like a sermon. But the small kindnesses mattered more. 1 month later, the house had settled into a rhythm. Milo had painted a small mural in the nursery, and Matteo had installed a better lock on the gate. Naomi's second column reframed the story into one that discussed consent and protection, and the comments under it were a mix of sympathy and anger. In the city, the mark had shifted how I was seen. Some people looked at me with respect, others with suspicion. The baby was a rumor with a heartbeat and a set of measured growth charts. I woke up feeling regressed and strengthened, an odd pairing of feelings that taste like coffee and salt. Life was still an uneasy balance, but we were making it. 3 months later passed, and the rumors had turned into a small movement of sorts. Naomi's article prompted a small support group of people who had been stigmatized to reach out through messages. The clinic started offering a weekly night for expectant Omegas, with a woman named Elsa coordinating donations of clothing and a midwife named Anna who came as a volunteer. The townhouse opened its doors to neighbors for a community meal once a week, and the alphas sat at the end of the table sipping slowly and listening to people speak. The developer lost a contract, and his company had a shakeup, and a few concrete people who had supported his intimidation were arrested because of a chain of evidence Nico brought. The city did not change overnight, but pockets of progress formed like green shoots in winter. 6 months later, the baby's room smelled of paint and powdered milk and a particular perfume Milo favored. I had my name on a small legal certificate that recognized my status, and the mark was now a fact of daily life. The house had become a family, the way old trees claim the ground they stand on. Armand kept watches in ways that were gentler. He no longer had a blade ready at every sound, but rather a plan and a schedule. Milo hummed more often and taught the baby lullabies in a language I had almost forgotten existed. Nico had a quiet satisfaction in the legal amendments he had pushed through, and in the community legal clinic he helped fund for people who had no representation. The epilogue, 1 month later. 1 month after the marking, I walked down the street with a lightness I had not held in years. The city did not suddenly adore me, but there was less whispering in doorways, and the clinic line at noon had one less cruel joke. My belly was a visible curve, and people looked without turning hostile. I still kept my receipts, and my phone had numbers on speed dial like little lifelines. Milo and Armand replaced the crooked picture in my hallway with a new frame, and Nico called me once a day just to talk about nothing at all. The world had not become safe, but I had a network that reacted like a well-tuned engine, and that made danger feel like an alarm rather than a total collapse. The epilogue 3 months later. 3 months on, we began hosting community meals. The house filled with the smell of rice and saffron and the laughter of neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid us. Naomi ran a column about building unlikely families, and the town's conversation shifted into policy and small acts of kindness. Dr. Alvarez started a clinic night for those who could not afford regular checkups. And Officer Chen quietly recommended 2 officers to attend sensitivity training. The baby's movements were a steady punctuation in my day, and I had begun to speak at meetings about stigma in small, shaky breaths. I no longer saw myself only as a mark, but as someone who could teach and receive in equal measure. The epilogue, 6 months later. At 6 months, the baby had a name that Milo and I chose together. It was at once soft and firm, a sound that felt like a promise. The legal process had granted us a small victory. The developer's company paid damages, and the funds became a seed for a community fund administered by Nico and Cecilia, the lawyer. Our little household had plans for a small clinic wing and a safe shelter for people who were pregnant and stigmatized. We began taking applications for community consultation, and Naomi wrote that our story was not a fairy tale, but an ongoing negotiation of power and love. The city still had its dangers, but we were no longer invisible, and that visibility had become our shield and our weapon. If you have 5 minutes, I want to ask you to think about this story, not as a neat moral, but as a messy life. People like me do not want to be trophies, and we do not want to be rescues. We want choices and dignity. If this story touched you, start your comment with, "If it were me," and tell someone what you would do or how you would offer help. Your voice can be a small map for others who do not yet know which way to go. Your words become part of a community that decides how to treat its most fragile members, and that matters more than any headline. When I look back now, I see the arc as one of repair and compromise. In the end, protection was never only about fences or marks. It became about people who learned to be less cruel and more brave. It was about a cold man who learned to soften his edges, a tender man who learned to be fierce, and a practical man who put plans into motion and then learned to let go a little. I learned that belonging is not an erasure, but a negotiation that can make space for both the self you carry and the family you build. The city did not change overnight, but in small ways it bent toward justice because a handful of people decided it should. If this story touched you and you want more stories of messy love and complicated families, subscribe for more pieces like this. We share tales of people who find shelter in unlikely places and who carve out belonging from the noise. If you want to help in real life, check your local community resources, donate to legal clinics, and stand with people who are marked by society for who they love or who they will become. I will end with this small line because it is as true now as the night the rain started to fall. Was called a mistake by strangers, but I made a home out of defiance and tenderness, and the child I carry will know a family that chose him before the city decided his fate.